Good to go.
Okay. Welcome to some month's cab call. I believe it's the month of May.
Wait, it's not April?
I can't really keep track. I actually literally have to check the calendar to see what month it is.
April's for fools anyways.
Welcome. Thank you all for coming to the Cloud Foundry Community Advisory Board meeting for the month of May. Thank you for coming. We've got the usual updates. First from the Cloud Foundry Foundation, we have Chip here, maybe others that I can't see. And we will go through the PMC project highlights. And then we have two presentations from T-Mobile. And I believe we have the people from T-Mobile. And excuse me, I don't have the names of the people from T-Mobile in front of me. So if you could introduce yourselves as we kick off. First, dealing with noisy neighbor problems on CF, and also another presentation on automating the lifecycle management of large-scale CF environments. So to kick things off, can I turn this over to you, Chip, and let us know what's happening with Cloud Foundry Foundation?
Yeah, we're going to keep it quick. Sometimes I feel like these updates are just about events. So this update's just about an event. We announced the schedule for the, in really big air quote, North American Summit. Just happens to be centered on the US Central time zone, but it'll be clustered in the morning of 2 days, right? So June 24th, June 25th. Hopefully that's not too late for our friends that are based in Europe, and might be a little bit early for those of you that are based on the North American West Coast. But we're trying to kind of do our best to pick a time zone that's going to work, across as many geographies as possible. Sometimes I also wish that we were actually a flat Earth, so that we could just truly eliminate time zones, and that would be great. So anyway, schedule's out, registration's open. Anybody on the CF Dev mailing list should have seen a contributor code. Feel free to use it if you're on that mailing list. Any member or all of our primary member contacts have received codes to register. So lots of opportunities to get registered and see some really interesting content. I'll say it, I've said it before, I'll say it again. This is a virtual event. Everybody's going virtual. Nobody knows how to actually do it. We're all learning from each other, both the commercial companies, and SUSE, as an example, I think is actively running a event right now virtually, using the same platform that we'll be using. So there's quite a lot of interesting things that we're going to learn from that. So with that, I'm done talking about events. Everything else that we do is in support of the project. So we should roll over to project updates.
I wondered, I wanted to highlight that Spring One also has its CFP closing today, and there's a Cloud Foundry track for anyone who's interested in submitting a talk to the Cloud Foundry track at for spring1.io.
Awesome. That's a great point, Yui. And like everything else, it'll be virtual, right?
Yes, it'll be virtual. I believe in August.
Yeah.
Is the date?
Cool.
If you could drop that in the agenda, we'll use that for notes too. That link to that would be great. Have we got someone, actually, is it you, for app runtime PMC, or would that be, is Eric? Oh, Eric's here.
That's right. Yeah, I can cover that. Yeah, a few highlights from the runtime PMC. I've had some big releases from the integration projects, release integration, release CF deployment version 13, and version 0.2 of CF for K8s over the past month. And not to be outdone, kubecf released its version 2.0. And I know they've been busy integrating some of the Helm charts like Irene and IreneX into that release to replace the Bosch release derived artifacts. And then also, this is something that I think we'll have more and more information and communication about over the next few months, but the CLI team is getting ready to release the initial GA version of the V7 CLI. So this is going to have some breaking changes compared to V6, primarily in support of things like rolling updates and other commands that relate to the V3 APIs that Cloud Controller has been developing underneath that to support those kinds of operations over the years.
Quick question: is the breakage only in the V3 API calls?
Well, I think the V7 refers to just some of the commands having breaking changes in the CFCLI. I'm not sure exactly which ones off the top of my head, but expect they'll have more details about any commands that are changing. I mean, a lot of them are just staying the same.
Yeah, they do have an extensive document that they publish.
Oh, great. Okay.
You have to have some.
Yeah. And then in terms of other project updates, so CAPI's been moving along with its integration with KPAC in the Kate space to allow for operations like updating the build packs and rootfs that KPAC is managing for application images, and then figuring out how those rootfs updates, for example, are going to propagate out to application instances in that context. So other improvements, Irene now supports rolling deploys for applications, and they are working to support application tasks as well. And networking, I know we've discussed this in some other arenas, but they've been driving out some work around having a CRD for CF routes. And so they're continuing work to integrate with that and to support that as a way of translating routing information into the underlying Kubernetes cluster. And then the logging and metrics team, which we've recently renamed from Logaggregator to correctly denote their full scope of responsibilities. They've recently finished working with the CAPI team to get Cloud Controller metrics exposed via a Prometheus exporter, again, in a Kubernetes deployment. And they've also been working on how to inject the logs from control plane components, such as Cloud Controller or the routing tier into application log streams in the K8s distributions. So, those are some of the highlights, but as always, people are welcome to drop into the App Runtime PMC meetings, which happen every 2 weeks, and ask questions there too.
Thanks so much, Eric. Just a tiny thing about kubecf. I know they actually released a 2.2 recently to fix some breakage in 2.0 that people noticed. Have we got someone representing the Bosch PMC here today? And I'm going to take a wild guess that we also don't have Dr. Max for extensions, because he is trying to vacate that position. And I wanted to call people's attention to Swarna's post from a few weeks ago, seeking nominations for the Cloud Foundry Extensions PMC lead. SUSE has been, I've been looking around to see if there's some volunteers at SUSE. We may not have someone that I can nominate for that position. So I would like to suggest that this is a good opportunity for another organization in the community or another individual in the community who's interested in seeing the Extensions PMC grow to step up and volunteer for this. You can talk to any of the foundation people or myself about that on Slack. If you don't feel comfortable speaking up now or nominating yourself in the mailing list like I did for this job. So just calling your attention to that, there is a vacancy. We'd love to see someone who has a passion for all of the extensions in the community and making that community grow a little bit. So please have a look at that post and have a think about if you'd like to lead that. And I'll continue looking around for voluntelling people at SUSE. With that, if there's nothing else from the PMC projects, can I hand it off to somebody from T-Mobile? And I believe we have.
Hey, Troy.
Hi, Savani.
Hi, I'm Savani from T-Mobile. We do have a bunch of folks here. We have Eamon McGuire, who will be covering noisy neighbors, and then Brandon Indrick, who will be covering automation lifecycle. So we're all here.
Okay, excellent. I'll note down a name. So it's Eamon. And should we pass presenter to you, Eamon?
Sure.
Somebody, Ashley, can you do that?
Do what?
Pass presenter, right? Or you
It
can
should
just
have
share.
a share
You can
screen
just share
button.
screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see here. All right. Excuse me. So, yeah, I'm Eamon McGuire. I'm with T-Mobile on the platform, excuse me, platform and infrastructure engineering team, and I'm going to be doing a presentation about how we managed our log losses at scale. So when I say scale, our scale is pretty big in terms of PCF users. Got over 20 foundations, over 20 individual deployments of PCF in various data centers, regions across the country. We have over 70,000 containers, over 700 million daily transactions, 3,000 individual applications, and over 100 different application teams. So it's really big, really complicated problem to solve, so especially given the size of our team, which is right now we're about four or five people that kind of concentrate on this. We have some ancillary help from other teams, but it's a big challenge. So the issue that we had been running into was that we were seeing frequent, excuse me, frequent severe log loss across excuse me, frequency or log loss across applications on PCF. This could be in any step in the chain. Essentially, it could be in our log aggregator components. Our log aggregator components, now syslog agent in the newer version, feeds into our syslog components. Our syslog components are pulled off by a Splunk forwarder, and on the Splunk side, we've got indexers and various components. So at any step in the chain there, we could see issues with, CPU or memory or just queues filling up and so on and so forth. And what we found out was that more often than not, the cause of the problem was the noisy neighbor. So an application that was just logging really excessively. And since it's a shared platform, we've got the containers on the Diego cell sharing the components to get the logs off of the node. Same thing with the syslog nodes and the Splunk forwarders. That there was typically a single or just a few applications that were responsible for flooding everything and causing the log loss. So how much log loss were we seeing? At some points, we were seeing up to 75% log loss. So this was typically somebody would be doing a load test, or they left info on, or there was some kind of a stack trace printing out 1,000-line stack trace line by line, millions of times a second or something ridiculous like that. So we could see peaks like that. On a sustained basis, we could see in excess of 15% log loss. Even when we weren't seeing log loss, we were seeing substantial delays. Just the components have various queues and so on that fill up with the messages. And then those messages are, pull off of the queue and eventually sent down the pipeline. So those components were all becoming overwhelmed. So even when they weren't being dropped, we would see delays of 15, 30, sometimes an hour due to various issues along the chain. Another issue that we had was just in terms of the physical retention. After the logs actually get to Splunk, how we're retaining them, of course, as SSDs and platter drives and so on. And our retention is determined by how much space we have left and how quickly we're using that space. So because of how noisy these neighbors were, because of how much they were logging on these disks, they were filling up really quickly. And at some points we had, under 4 days retention, which is not really helpful for teams that figure out, they had to have a bug today and they're trying to trace it back to their last release, a week ago or something to that effect, and the logs don't exist, or they're trying to do some kind of reporting or reconciliation or just trying to track something down. It's unusual to catch something unless it's really bad within, that time window. So it wasn't a good experience. Some of the challenges that we had in just kind of tackling the issue was the complexity of the infrastructure, the fact that we didn't necessarily own every component. The Splunk team was an entirely different team. We didn't have a good view from the application perspective. Because we didn't own all of the components, we didn't have a consistent alerting approach. And because of the various points in the chain where we could see this issue, it ended up being basically an ad hoc process. So we'd have our daytime on-call would be getting complaints from customers, or they'd be seeing an alert on a Loggergator component, or a Splunk component would trip and they'd contact us. So then we'd kind of get in and just poke around and try and figure out, okay, where's the noisy neighbor? Because that's more often than not, that was the issue. We'd be able to track them down with, some ad hoc queries. Then we'd need to go and manually look up, okay, who owns this application, and then generate the email and try and get that team, on a bridge if we needed to. And it took a long time, and people were losing logs all the while. So, it was just not a good customer experience. So in order to solve it, we started out by saying, okay, what's our, service level objective? What do we want to accomplish? Okay, how do we get the users to help us accomplish this? So the terms of service for the users, and how do we figure out when users or customers are violating those terms of service, and what's the mechanism we can use to inform them so that they can take action? So the objective SLO that we ended up coming up with was 90%. We felt 90% was reasonable at all times. Ideally more than that most of the time, but that we should never have fewer than 90% of our logs reach the end destination, which for us is Splunk. Within a reasonable time frame. We shouldn't be seeing big delays. We shouldn't be dropping anything. And in terms of, the terms of service for the users, just based on our observations about when the component started to see issues, and based on some of our conversations with Pivotal, we decided that an individual application incident shouldn't exceed 100,000 logs per minute, and that an individual application instance should never exceed, a burst rate of more than 1 million logs per minute, which sounds ridiculous, but we've had applications log a lot more than 1 million logs per minute, and it's a wonder they stay running, but we do see that. So in terms of the implementation that we came up with, the solution was a set of microservices, and we have a job that runs on concourse via cron. Right now it's every hour. So we post a query and a callback URL to our Splunk query service, and the Splunk query service has knowledge and credentials of the Splunk clusters that it needs to interact with. It'll execute that query against each of those clusters. We have one for NP, our non-production, one for our payment cards concerns, and then one for our production traffic. From each of those, it determines which applications are violating the terms of service just based on, some query language, and it gets back the metadata that we have about those orgs. Some of that is added from, from our syslog infrastructure, and some of that's just there by default. So it'll collect that information, it'll bundle that up in some JSON, and it'll post that to our noisy neighbor microservice. The noisy neighbor microservice takes those org names and looks in our internal metadata store about those orgs, which for us right now is, is Bitbucket. It'll get back the configs that show which orgs map to which owners, which in our internal infrastructure will be employee IDs. So it gathers up those employee IDs, sends that to our email lookup service. The email lookup service interacts with our LDAP service, converts those employee IDs to email addresses, sends that back to the noisy neighbor service, and then finally the noisy neighbor service bundles that all together, puts it into a templated email, and ships that off to our customers via our SMTP server. In terms of the email itself, we have some helpful tips on there, some things that we've seen in the past. I mentioned a few at the beginning of the talk. So logging stack traces with line breaks. So you could see 1,000 line stack trace, but if there's line breaks, that's 1,000 individual events per stack trace. And if you've got some, recurrent error, we've seen this with, for example, interactions with Kafka or people trying to reinitiate sessions, it's thousands and thousands of lines, every second, which is not ideal. There are some other cases where people will leave on info or debug because they were debugging something locally or in a non-production environment, or those sorts of things. So we give them some tips on how to address it. Then kind of the idea here is we say, hey, if this isn't addressed in the next X hours, and that's, that fluctuates depending on the environment and the severity of the logging, then we'll need to, unfortunately, disconnect you from the logging infrastructure because, we need to preserve the health of the platform for our other tenants as well. So in terms of how effective it is, this is a chart of when we first released this, and it does really work, which we're very happy with. So we've been consistently meeting our SLO since we released the Noisy Neighbor, and for the most part, customers have been, actually glad to hear that. They have no idea that they're logging that much, or we end up catching an error that they weren't even aware of. It's been helpful for the customer, helpful for the health of the platform in getting all of our logs to their destination. It's improved our retention on the Splunk side of things, and in terms of our support or on-call during the day, we're saving on the order of, some days a couple of hours we'd have to spend on this that we don't have to spend now. So it's been really helpful. And that is the last slide. So if anyone has any questions.
I think the example anti-patterns that you described that some of the developers were doing was really useful. So maybe that's just more a comment. Thank you for that. That was like my question coming into it.
That's very insightful, yes, because we do have a case where one time there was someone that was putting the application in debug mode by accident, and that took up half our logging capacity. So, but I thought that Cloud Foundry itself already had some kind of mechanism to prevent this kind of thing, or am I mistaken on that point?
In 2.9, there is an emerging feature.
I remember they mentioned that somewhere, yes.
Basis, yeah. So we're looking forward to trying that out. We're a couple of minor versions behind, and since we've got such a big infrastructure, it's going to take us a while to get there. And we typically
I can manage that. Okay, cool. And another question, if I may. I remember I saw an earlier presentation some time ago, also from T-Mobile, about you're also using Splunk for the reporting. How you say that? The smoke test results were also going to Splunk, I believe. I mean, wouldn't you lose that kind of thing if Splunk gets overwhelmed, or Splunk is not the problem here, or?
On occasion, Splunk has been the problem. When it comes to log loss in total, that typically would have been in our logger-gator infrastructure. We have seen instances where the indexers and other components on Splunk were becoming overwhelmed, and we would see delays there. Our metrics are in a separate index, so
okay.
they have a bit of a buffer there.
Cool.
Is any of this tooling open sourced?
Not yet, no.
It would definitely be interesting. We have similar problems there. And even though we're not large, this kind of thing can happen to anyone, I guess.
You said not yet, so.
We smell a new project coming up.
Well, I can imagine this is in many places very specific to T-Mobile, but if you have any inclination, I know this community would appreciate having a look at
definitely,
or at least parts of it.
All right, great, thanks.
Yeah, the Cloud Foundry community repo is happy to host any and all sorts of things.
Perhaps, particularly in the extensions PMC. Yeah, I remind. Okay, who is next?
That would be me. Give me just one moment and I'll share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. My name is Brandon Indrick. I'm also on the platform infrastructure engineering team, and this presentation is about lifecycle automation. And obviously, the T-Mobile. So, refresher on our scale, as Eamon already covered this, 20 plus foundations, 70,000 containers, 700 million daily transactions, 3,000 plus applications, and 100 very different dev teams. Fairly large scale that we have to deal with in this manner. So, challenges before automation, consistency. This was a big one. Every time we brought a foundation online, the parameter changes or the tiles that we used or the versions that we used would sometimes vary. And the more foundations we brought online, the greater that variance became. Made it very hard to predictably upgrade or update things. Also, we didn't really have any change tracking mechanism. So if an engineer made a little change to test something and saved it, we weren't aware of that. There wasn't necessarily, everyone on the team wasn't necessarily on the same page, or stuff was not noted, or documentation wasn't updated. As you can see, this would also cause problems during upgrades. Two foundations should have the same settings, but don't. You go to do an upgrade, you get unpredictable results. This resulted in lengthy and chaotic upgrades. It would take a couple of weeks to get a single foundation a point upgrade. Very challenging in the early days before we had automation. So our solution, we use Pivotal Platform Automation and Concourse pipelines. We've stored the foundation configurations in source control. All of those documentations are now living documents, as in whenever we go to use them, we're updating the configuration files themselves and then staging the changes so that anything that is in those configs is actively being used. We don't really have to worry about them going out of date. So anytime we need to look at settings or previous history, anything along those lines, we can look in source control and see what exactly took place there. We also settled on no manual deployments. Ideally, everything should be run through automation. It reduces errors, reduces copy and paste problems, those sort of things. And it also provides a paper trail, if you will, for any changes that we make. This also required a bit of team process. People were used to doing things in Ops Manager directly and by hand. This required a little bit of a mindset change to make that happen, but through team agreements, we managed to push through and do that. This helped maintain consistency. We also have a peer review process that requires at least a minimum of 2 engineers to look at any changes that are going to be made and approve them before we actually do them. This helps, reduce fatigue when you're making lots of changes, helps reduce mistakes, those sort of things. We also use Slack to make all of our communications for these things, and I'll show an example of that in a little bit. This is our pipeline flow overview. So I'll be going through this a little bit more in detail later, but just to give you a rough idea, each one of these is for an individual tile, and the entire tile process we'll check for pending changes, we'll perform the initial backup, we'll stage those changes, we'll then perform another backup, and then we will compare those backups and look at any drifts that are there. This helps us eliminate potentially introducing any unwanted variables and also make sure that we're putting the right stuff in. This is what we use for our Slack notifications for our automation. We cover stuff such as job starts, succeeds, failures, job aborted, pretty much any state that you can get in Concourse, we've got it covered here. An example to the right, these are jobs starting, and then also their statuses as they continue or re-trigger as they go through the pipeline. And at the very bottom there, you can see that there's a job failure. It's got a different emoji, different color to bring attention to us. This is something that the entire team keeps an eye on a regular basis. So we know pretty much what's going on in any given foundation with the automation just by looking in the Slack channel. So the actual process, we make our changes locally. So we create a branch based off of master. It allows for multiple engineers to work on individual foundations at the same time. Once changes have been prepared, they are checked into source control and pushed upstream. By having configuration changes in source control, we have a snapshot in time of who applied what changes, when, and to what foundation. This allows for change accountability and tracking. And if needed, we reflow the pipelines. So this is our backup job. We have Slack notifications, as you can see in the top there. We pull down the images and tasks from platform automation. We pull in our main repositories. We then run the tasks, and then we send the follow-up Slack notifications. This is the pending change job. This will go through and check and see if there are pending changes. Basically, the idea is if somebody makes a change in Opsman and they save it, but they don't actually apply those changes, or in the event that an apply changes failed and it got left in that state, this will check each product in Opsman to make sure there are no pending changes. If there are, it will halt in its process, and then you have to go in and remediate it, figure out if what had changed, or in the case, revert Opsman and then move forward. This is a backup. This will go through and back up all the parameters in the tile, and then it will check those into source control for future use. This is where the tile staging happens. Configuration files are interpolated and output for use later in the pipeline. In short, this process replaces any pipeline vars in a tile set of configuration files. The tile specified in the version config is examined, and its requirements are printed in console for future reference. That's the configure product portion of it. It looks like I skipped ahead just slightly there. We also go through and upload the stem cell. We upload the tile, and then finally we configure the product. So the tile is then configured with the interpolated configurations from one of the previous steps. If all goes well, we move forward onto the next step. If there's a problem with the staging params, it is reviewed, updated in the configs, and then the job is kicked off again. We like to fail forward in this sense. It's very easy for this to happen. A simple typo in the configuration file, or a small change, or we forgot to add a param for a new tile version, something along those lines. It doesn't stop us really. We just figure out what the problem is, fix it in the configs, restage it, and off we go. We don't have to rerun the backup or any of that stuff since it's already been done and it was in a clean state. This is a post-stage backup step, pretty much the same as the first one. When you take a backup of the tiles, it gets whatever the current state is. And so whatever is currently staged as those parameters, that's what it's going to grab, and it's going to back that up. This is where we do the drift validation, and this right here has been kind of the key to our success. We go through, and once this process is done, we post links to our pending changes. I have a separate job that actually runs that you can see the pending changes, so we know exactly what we're supposed to be looking at. We post links to the drift, which, as you can see on the right-hand side here, is a small example of what that looks like. And then there's a couple of the jobs that we run before we kick anything off. We post that in Slack. We get approvals on it. We review them. We take a look at the changes, make sure this is what we want, that anything didn't slip in, etc. And then we move forward. This is what applying changes actually looks like. Sure, everyone's familiar with the Bosch, or the Opsman apply changes screen. This is how we communicate stuff in Slack. Once we kick off the changes, we post what it's doing, and then we update the emojis accordingly so that we have a good idea of where we're at. Anybody on the team, management, anybody really that is part of our Slack channel for this can take a look and see where we are with any deployment at any given time. So as a reminder, before automation, we had consistency issues. We had challenges tracking any sort of changes or updates or anything along those lines, and it was lengthy and chaotic upgrades. Here's where we are today. All of our tiles are backed by configuration files. Foundation consistency was all over the board. Now it's at an all-time high. From no change tracking to full change tracking, verification, and accountability. Moving from one foundation single point upgrade every 2 weeks to 3+ multi-point foundations per week. And what I mean by that, we are currently in the process of upgrading from 2.4 to 2.7 and have been running 2 to 3 foundation blitz per week from start to finish. Huge difference in the amount of time that it takes to actually get upgrades. And not to mention, this is pretty much due to lack of failures along the way and what have you. So I'd like to give a special thanks to Neeraj and JP, two of my team members. Both of them worked very hard on the initial path to getting us rolling with automation upgrades and deployment. And just wanted to say thank you guys. I really appreciated it. Also, I'd like to give an additional thanks to everyone on the platform team. Without your support, testing, and willingness to change, we would still be doing things the hard way, and I'm very happy that we are not. With that, questions?
Well, if I have a few, if I may. Actually, we're also looking into the platform automation tooling, which was like the follow-up on the PCF pipelines, if I'm correct. As I understand it, you basically use it to upgrade the platform or make changes in configuration. You do not use it for like initial deployment. I assume the platform was already existing before you started to automate, right?
Well, so
Because
to,
yeah.
to answer your question,
Sorry.
we did have foundations in place before we started doing the automation. That is correct. However, we roll out any new foundations with using platform automation.
Oh, cool.
This presentation was summed up. There's actually a lot of other jobs that I have running on platform automation specifically that I wasn't really able to cover here. But yeah, we are using it. And also those foundations that we initially brought online that had all the different changes, those got folded in to automation. And now, as we've gone through several upgrades, they've all consistently updated and become very similar as we move forward with that. So the only real difference for installing a new foundation versus upgrading a foundation is one job. We have an install option instead of an upgrade option, and it operates very similar.
Okay, cool. Because I understood from engineers who were working on this were like most of the time they spent on creating the initial setup, basically.
No, so the way we handle it is that we run the install option job, which, as I said, is very similar. There's a couple of things you have to set up first. Basically, you need to set up a state file for tracking, that sort of thing, what version you want to run. You got to make sure your tile for that and all that's in a S3 repository with the rest of our tiles. Once you run that, you install it. And then from there, we treat it just like a regular foundation in the upgrade process. We don't put the tiles on there ahead of time or any of that thing. We treat it just like we were running an upgrade on it. And through the nature of how this is done, it's just going to install those instead of update them. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, it makes sense. Thank you very much.
We also go through and we have a template for each foundation that we have, because each foundation does have its own set of template and config files. We have a template for that. We just copy that over and then we update the values to reflect what we want for that foundation. And it's going to be all unique things like IP addresses,
and domains,
data stored information.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
No. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Brandon. It's a lot to absorb. I'm wondering if we can see a copy of your slides, or if you've blogged this anywhere that we can reference.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a copy of the slides. And so the other thing too, there is a lot to cover, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to assist where I can. It's a bit of an undertaking if you are not familiar or haven't worked on it before, so happy to help where I can.
I know for myself, I was trying to map what is applicable here from PCF tiles to just Cloud Foundry application runtime, open source, or another distro. A lot of really good best practices there that you've implemented. I just need to pick it apart and actually read some stuff and think about it.
I think it can be more general because Bosch is doing all the heavy lifting here. So
exactly.
Jos manager is just like a YAML generator, as far as I see it.
Well, yeah. So processor, I would say more
yeah,
processor. You still have to generate
processor.
the YAML.
It's taking parameters, a YAML file, and spits out something Bosch understands.
This is one thing.
There is a little bit
in this community. It's processing YAML.
Yeah, it's lots of YAML, and there's a couple of things under the hood that's going on. You'll notice there's 3 slides towards the end that talk about it. We're using a hierarchy of global, context, and local changes. Basically, I've stripped it out so that all of our global changes that are ubiquitous across all foundations exist at the global level. And then you've got a context, which are network specific. Certain network have certain requirements, and then those fall there. And then we have our local files for YAML that are all the stuff like IPs, data stores, that sort of thing. Basically, when we do our upgrades, once everything is set in place, you generally don't touch the global or context files during the upgrade. You'll do it once for the initial upgrade, and then you just update the little local files. Something to the effect of there's around, I don't know, 400 lines in your standard patch config file. This shortens it down to 50 lines at most that you're looking at any given time per foundation. So Yeah, I have notes on that.
Cool.
I'll send that along with a slide. If anyone has questions about
Definitely.
that, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah,
And I'll try and-
especially. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, no.
Oh, sorry. Especially that multi-foundation thing I'm interested in. As far as I remember, the PCF the automation tooling was basically designed to upgrade a single site. So I'm also wondering how you tackle with the relations. Is there like a dependency between sites, or is that each site is updated independently?
Well, so the way we're kind of handling that is twofold. So on the Concourse side of things, we have regional deployments for all of our major regions, and inside of those regions, we have context-specific foundation deployments. So we'll basically use the teams in Concourse to manage which pipeline runs for what. So we have our staging foundation, for example, is TT Stage and TT Stage 02, just for examples. Those will each have their own team, and inside of them, those teams will have pipelines specific to those foundations. We also have, in the repo structure, we have it split out in such a way that all the configuration files are split in there. And through the use of parameter files when flying the pipeline, specifies all the relevant information for that individual foundation. So yeah, we basically sidestepped that whole problem.
Okay, thank you for the feedback. It's very interesting.
Anyone else? Any other questions for Brandon? I really want to thank the T-Mobile team for proposing these great talks and for delivering them. And I'll figure out with you guys offline what the best way is to share this with the wider organization. We'll link it from a CF Dev post or something. I'm not sure where we keep things like this, but maybe we got to create a place where we can share past and present CAB presentations. But thank you very much for that. There's a little bit of time left over for open discussion items if we want to do that, or we can take back a bit of our day and do other things. Okay, well, thanks everyone very much for joining us today. Thanks to everyone, to Eric for presenting the apps runtime updates. Thanks Chip for the foundation updates, and of course, thank you very much to the T-Mobile team for presenting today and making this a really, really information-packed CAB meeting. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.